Hello, I'm Perrin, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the pandemic, I'll be having a series of conversations with business leaders, government officials, and other experts on the pandemic and how the business community has been responding. My guest today is Tim McMillan, who's been President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers for the past 6 years. Now, for those who don't know, CAPP is the organization that represents the upstream Canadian oil and natural gas industry. Its members produce over 80% of Canada's natural gas and crude oil. Tim himself is a Saskatchewan native who grew up on a family farm near Lloydminster, where the McMillan family has homesteaded for more than a century. After earning an economics degree from the University of Victoria, he returned to the family farm and founded and operated an oil field services company. In 2007, Tim was elected as a Saskatchewan Party MLA in the riding of Lloydminster. From 2010 until his appointment as President and CEO of CAPP, Tim held several strategic cabinet portfolios in the government of Saskatchewan, including Minister of Energy. Tim, welcome to the Business of Business.
Great, thank you for having me.
Well, so let's talk about the sector and about the impact that COVID-19 has had on the sector. This was a sector which was hurting long before COVID struck. And when COVID came along, obviously that's had an impact both in terms of the ability of businesses to be able to continue to safely produce, but also in terms of demand. Can you give us a sense as to what you've been hearing from your members?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our sector is one that was affected early and maybe more than most others in those early days, partly because we were in Canada seeing investment leave to other jurisdictions for several years. We weren't a healthy, robust industry that we had been in the first part of the last decade. The other piece is that Saudi Arabia and Russia took the opportunity of the global pandemic to try and go after market share. They flooded the market and drove costs out to exacerbate the effects of the pandemic. Ultimately, for us, the first priority was to ensure that we could maintain our operations safely. We can continue to supply fuel and heating to Canadians through the pandemic, and with the help of governments, we were able to get provisions in place that was maintained. But then we ran into the liquidity challenges. We saw $8.5 billion worth of capital evaporate out of this year's work plans in just a matter of weeks. And we saw the economic challenges really cascading across our member companies, that some stronger than others, but everybody was seeing that bottom line being crushed as oil prices went into the negatives for a period of time. And still, even to this day, as we see the rebound in consumption globally, we still see prices muted at about that $40 a barrel level because inventories built up so much around the world.
So for the sector, then it was really the perfect storm. Prices were weak even before COVID hit, and you had countries flooding the market and driving down prices even further. What's happened in terms of employment in the sector?
Yeah, when you see $8.5 billion get taken out of this year's work plans, that means that there's a large impact on employees, unfortunately, not just of our member companies, but a broad supply network across Canada. We estimate about 100,000 people in that supply network and in our companies on the producer side lost their jobs in the last few months. And that's unfortunate, but it gives us a platform of what we could do if we are able to bring that capital back in.
The impact is felt right across the country because supply chains are so broad for the sector, but is particularly concentrated in Western Canada, which creates a special problem as well. Particularly in Alberta, the economy was slow before. In Calgary, we saw so many offices which were empty. The impact on business has been very severe there. Can you comment as well on the regional impacts of this?
Yeah, it I guess has been several years of challenge where lack of pipeline capacity and regulatory delays. We've seen projects that have been shelved, others that just haven't even come forward to that regulatory process. And the teams that have been so strong in Western Canada, developing new projects have largely been whittled away until there's very little growth employment, and the types of jobs that we're developing new projects, we just don't see them populating the buildings and that important part of the ecosystem. I would want to also mention, though, that the effects have been acute in Atlantic Canada. That since the pandemic, we have seen major projects be from being online being put to the side and say, unless things change.
The Husky project, Suncor also has investments in the Atlantic area.
And the importance of the oil and gas industry in Atlantic Canada is maybe even more so than it is in Western Canada. So, I would really want to highlight that there's some challenges there and some actions that we're looking for from government to support those coming back online.
The federal government was very fast in responding to the concerns of many industries. And in May and June, we were hearing that they understood the challenge there was for the energy sector and that we could expect that they would respond in a favorable way. What have we seen that's been directed precisely at the energy sector?
I would want to recognize that they reached out early. We had ongoing discussions with them, primarily around liquidity and around some stimulus funding for the service sector around orphan and inactive wells. They flowed over, I think it's $1.5 billion to provinces to stimulate the orphan and inactive well abandonments. And that, I think, was very helpful and will be very helpful through the next months and years to get those service providers out and doing the work. On the liquidity side, maybe more challenging that they were early to identify that as a problem and keen to provide support. They came out with 3 programs, the LEAF for the large companies, EDC and BDC each had programs for liquidity for middle and smaller companies. Unfortunately, I don't think a single dollar has flowed yet on the liquidity side. I know some companies have been approved, but it has been a struggle, and that is something where moving fast was of paramount importance. We can't check the box of that being an effective program yet.
The other area where the government tried to respond is they recognized the burden being put on businesses as they were struggling to deal with the pandemic of new regulations coming out. And they have put on a standstill of much of the new regulation over the course of the last several months, except your industry appears to be an exception. Can you comment on regulatory initiatives and what impact they're having on the sector?
That's been one of our big challenges in the last several years, is that it has been increasingly difficult to get projects approved and moving forward in Canada. Bill C-69 of a year ago might have been a very visible sign of that, but regulatory change in Canada continues to move. One of the big ones we're looking at right now is the Clean Fuel Standard, and global investors continually tell our member companies and tell us that Canada is a place that is not recognized as a pro-oil and gas jurisdiction. And when they're looking to allocate capital within their company or otherwise, Canada starts from a long ways back and has to play catch up. And it's very difficult to get projects moving forward. We thought that the throne speech would have been an opportunity for the federal government to send a very clear signal to those global investors that, in fact, we are in a recession, that oil and gas needs to play a key role, and that they would be welcoming of energy investments. I think the throne speech, though it acknowledged our industry in certain ways, fell short of a mark that would be needed. And one of the big iconic pieces is that Clean Fuel Standard that local investors, Canadian employees are looking at that as a barrier to future investment and future jobs here in Canada.
Looking at the recovery, what role can oil and gas play in terms of a private sector-led recovery for Canada? The obvious issue for us is we need to restore economic growth in Canada. This is an area that has been a driver of the Canadian economy over the course of decades. What do you see as the role of oil and gas in terms of promoting Canada's recovery? What needs to be done to leverage that?
I think it's essential that oil and gas play a leadership role in the recovery. If we look back over the last several decades, it has been oil and gas investments growth and jobs that has pulled us out in those recessions. We're committed to do it again. That, as I noted earlier, we had to cancel $8.5 billion worth of projects that were scheduled for 2020. The opportunity to get those shovel-ready projects with the engineering done, the land has been acquired, is maybe the quickest $8.5 billion we can get back on the table. That being said, we haven't seen a big move on that capital investment coming back. Some new drilling has kicked off, but as the global economy is struggling, this isn't just a national problem. Every country is making changes, trying to attract that scarce capital to their jurisdiction. I think that Canada needs to be active and aggressive if we want to attract the capital. And maybe one of the examples that is very troubling for us right now is Newfoundland has seen major projects come off the table, where Norway, one of our large competitors, has actually sharpened their pencil, changed their legislation, and reinvigorated two projects that previously had been canceled and got them moving again and creating jobs. So when we look at head-to-head comparison with a jurisdiction that is very similar to us, we see the money in global energy flowing away from Canada today.
We often hear about the priority that the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway puts upon environmental issues and their hesitancy on oil and gas, and yet it doesn't appear to hold back the government of Norway in terms of their commitment to their industry, which has led to that Sovereign Wealth Fund and allowed it to be the size that it is.
Yeah, no, there's no limit on hypocrisy when Norway looks at Canadian investments versus domestic investments. And all this is happening in a context of the International Energy Agency this week came out and said natural gas is going to grow dramatically out to 2040. Oil is going to grow fairly dramatically out to the mid-2030s and then flatline at a record high amount of oil production globally. In that context, I think if we want to be environmentally responsible with that level of oil and gas production, we need countries like Canada that's investing in innovation and technology to be leading it. If we allow that production to shift to, Norway's a great country. They're going to invest in similar technologies, but Saudi Arabia, Russia, Nigeria, Venezuela, if that is who picks up this great demand growth, we're not going to meet our commitments on Paris or otherwise. So, I think we have an obligation on the economic side, but also on the environmental side, because the realities that are facing us are challenging.
Well, let's pick up on that and let's start first of all with the advances in technology. The campaign that was run against Canadian oil suggested that oil sands oil was the dirtiest in the world. That's an assertion with which you disagree. How do we stack up? How does a barrel of Canadian oil stack up compared to oil from California or from Saudi Arabia or Russia?
Yeah, no, I think that was a effective campaign, largely funded by U.S. activist groups, and very clearly glossing over that there's substantially higher carbon oil coming out of California today, maybe one of the most environmentally vocal states in the U.S. has a substantially higher carbon footprint per barrel than we do. But other than just poking fingers at others, if we look at ourselves, we also have a great story to tell. Oil sands has reduced greenhouse gas emissions per barrel by 25% in the last decade. And as we look forward, we see another 20% reduction potential in the next decade. We invest about 75% of all clean tech dollars in Canada, driving, it's not just about carbon, it's about using less water, cleaner air, smaller footprint on the land. But all that to be said, global demand's increasing, and Canada has a key role to play in not just improving ourselves, but developing technologies that can be used in other places.
Can you give us an idea of the magnitude of the investment that's been made by Canadian energy companies in new technologies and environmental technologies?
Absolutely. I think clean tech spending in Canada is about $1.4 billion a year. and oil and gas is 75% of that. So over $1 billion a year is going into clean tech and into innovation. And we've done some unique things on that front. We have decided that as a oil sand sector, that the companies will compete for manpower, they'll compete for land, they'll compete for pipeline capacity. But when it comes to environmental performance, that's a place for collaboration and cooperation to get the most value for money. They've established COSIA, they've shared over $1 billion worth of technologies, and they're working on the big challenges facing our industry in a way that I think no other industry in the world would collaborate in the way that we are to get a good outcome.
I want to touch on that point for a minute. That what is astonishing is that we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of intellectual property that's being freely shared among competitors, because there's a sense that we want to see all of the industry moving ahead to have better environmental standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something that the capitalist system is naturally inclined to, but several years ago, I think over a decade ago, the CEOs came together and said, you know, we will compete on all these fronts, but there's an imperative. We're all in this together. And not just Canada, there's a global imperative, but they knew that they could work together as Canadian CEOs, Canadian companies, and build something that was uniquely positioned for success.
We hear often that any exports of Canadian energy are to the detriment of the global climate. And yet the position taken by the energy is quite contrary. It sees itself as part of the solution as opposed to being the problem. Can you comment on how Canadian energy can help to actually reduce global warming?
For sure. That I think there's kind of two ways to look at it, and both of them position Canada very much at the center. The first is we have seen hundreds of millions of people globally get pulled out of poverty, and the tie between energy usage and alleviating poverty is almost one-to-one. And we see more of that coming in the decades ahead, that driving energy consumption. And there'll be more wind, there'll be more solar, more hydro, potentially more nuclear. But according to the International Energy Agency, there will be dramatically more oil and gas used. This is a good news story. I mean, better food, more freedom of travel, people that can heat their homes for the first time. In that world, Canada, Norway, maybe a couple other oil producing countries have an obligation to solve the big problems, because we can't rely on the Russias, the Venezuelas, or the Saudi Arabias to do it. So if we're looking at China, which is regularly bringing online more coal-fired generators for electricity, if we can displace a Chinese coal-fired generator with Canadian natural gas, for example, that would be a net plus for the global climate. Absolutely. That we looked at the ability that Canada has to supply natural gas to the world, and China being one of the most obvious markets. It is maybe the biggest single reduction that we can do as a nation is to build more LNG facilities to displace the coal build out. And I say build out, they're still building new coal power plants in China. So we need to both offset that build out as well as start to displace their existing fleet. And when we looked at what Canada would need to do for reductions to meet our Paris commitments, it would take about 5 LNG Canada-sized projects for Canada to get our full reductions and be compliant with Paris. I think that we have a gas potential that can exceed even that, and we can back even higher than our own responsibility here.
So let's look at how this is dealt with under international agreements. Canadian companies are dramatically increasing their investment in terms of environmental technologies. They're driving down the emissions per barrel of oil or per 1,000 cubic feet of gas. They're driving down costs. If they increase market share in the world and drive out less environmentally friendly technologies and products from other countries, that's good for the global climate. How's this accounted for? How does this affect how Canada is treated under international agreements? Is there incentive there for Canada to make these exports and to make a contribution to fighting climate change?
And great question. It's when we look at gas offsetting coal, the benefits are terrific. But if you even look at Canadian gas versus East African gas, Australian gas, or US gas, we have a lower carbon footprint than even the competitors on the gas side. The unfortunate piece is the current Paris Agreement, though it has a provision for this sort of offsetting and accounting for it, Article 6, they have never been able to articulate the rules. So we're left sitting on the sidelines, unable to account for the substantial savings. The largest benefit we can do globally, we today can't account for it under Paris, even though Paris contemplated that we should be able to. So it's very frustrating, but I don't think that should stop us as a nation or as an industry from doing the right thing. We can act today to lower global emissions. We should do it.
So if I understand it correctly, if we improve our performance as we've been doing and become more competitive, if we put in place the infrastructure to enable us to get to global markets, in fact, Canada will be penalized if we take greater market share?
Absolutely. That every gigajoule of gas, and when we liquefy it and put it on a ship, we account for 100% of that gas, even if it's going over to China to offset a equivalent amount of coal on a different ship coming from a different country. All the incentives are working the wrong way, and the global outcome is going to result in us having more coal and less gas, and gas coming from countries that today aren't even counting their carbon emissions.
Let's talk for a minute about how the industry has changed in Canada and how companies see themselves. So what I think many Canadians don't recognize is that a company like Suncor is one of the highest investors in renewable energy. And it's seeing itself less as an oil and gas company than as an energy company. What sort of changes have been taking place within the sector that people may not have noticed?
Yeah, that's a great point. Companies are looking at how, one, they drive down their own emissions. Two, they're looking at, as an energy company, where their expertise can be used to produce more energy in other ways. Something that a lot of people don't know is that the more wind and solar and renewables that you put on any electricity grid, it compels the need for more natural gas. That the ability of natural gas to scale up when the wind stops blowing or the clouds cloud over for a period of time, and then shut back down as soon as that intermittent energy is available, means that gas is a far better fit than coal or nuclear or other products. So, the synergies between our industry and renewables is strong. And as we start looking at the hydrogen economy, I think it opens up even more opportunity that today 95 to 99% of all hydrogen comes from natural gas. And the economics of doing that in the future, I think, get better, and we can use carbon capture and sequestration potentially to make it very responsible.
Can we talk for a minute about the relationship between the oil and gas sector and Canada's Indigenous peoples? We have a commitment in Canada to reconciliation, to trying to improve the standards of living of Indigenous communities and ensuring that they also have more engagement in their own economic development. If you watch on the news media, you could be forgiven for believing that all Indigenous communities in Canada are opposed to any development of the sector. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that a few years ago, people would have been fair to have that opinion from what they saw in the news, but it has been, I think, very heartening for me and those that I represent to see over the last few years the number of Indigenous voices that have stood up and continue to stand up and raise their hand and say that reconciliation is very important. Economic reconciliation is a key component of that, and that oil and gas plays a key role for many communities in Canada. That through some of the pipeline debates that we have had and the support that many Indigenous communities that are directly affected have had, I think has been hugely important in informing that debate. And we should never take that for granted. Some of the good news stories is that I just saw a paper that came out last week that Saskatchewan Indigenous women make more than average Indigenous employees across Canada. they also make more than non-Indigenous women in Saskatchewan if they work in the energy sector. I think that's one of many stories that we need to continue to tell.
There's another statistic that stands out for me, and again, it's Suncor, which is Canada's largest company in the sector, and that's that in terms of procurement from Indigenous businesses, that Suncor, in fact, does more procurement from Indigenous businesses than the federal government of Canada does.
Yeah. And if we also look at the procurement across our industry, over 400 Indigenous service and product providers provide products and services to the oil and gas industry in Canada. And the percentage of Indigenous procurement for our sector is higher than the federal government as a whole.
Final question. Let's look down the road, 5 or 10 years. How do you see the sector evolving? What do you think that Canada's energy sector will look like 5 or 10 years from now?
You know, I feel like we're at a bit of a Y in the road right now. That global demand continues to grow substantially. Canada has world-class resources. We've got a sophisticated workforce and supply chain that are geared to an energy sector, and we should be part of that growth scenario. That being said, it's a time where it's going to take active, deliberate measures to make Canada an attractive investment jurisdiction. If we miss the boat in the coming year to 18 months, I think 5 to 10 years from now will be a very muted energy and Canadian economy. That we are the largest exporter from Canada. 20% of Canada's exports are oil and gas. If we miss the boat here in the short term, it's going to have a very long-term effect on employment and the economy as a whole.
Tim, it's been a fascinating conversation. There's so much, but such a great story that the oil and gas sector in Canada has to tell. And what's striking to me is that this is a sector of which Canadians should be extremely proud, because we do it better than anybody else anywhere in the world. We meet the highest possible environmental standards. We have our standards of human rights, community consultation, and the technological standards that we meet are among the highest anywhere in the world. And yet we don't do as good a job as Canadians as we should be doing in telling our story to the rest of the world. I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with you about it today, and I'm grateful for the partnership we've had with CAPP in terms of working to support the sector and to support growth in Canadian business.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about these important issues. And I think that the Canadian Chamber is one of the strongest advocates for Canada in general and our many different industries that need to be firing on all cylinders in the months ahead.
Great. Many thanks.
Thank you.